The marble breakfast table gleamed under the morning light, but the air inside Judge Ethan Caldwell's mansion felt cold and heavy. His twin daughters sat frozen, two little mirrors of fear clutching their untouched cereal bowls. Why do you keep failing the one subject that matters most? His voice cracked through the silence like thunder. A porcelain cup slipped from his hand, shattering across the floor. The sound echoed through the dining hall, sharp as judgment. Brooke's eyes welled up, her lips trembling. We tried, Daddy. Tried. The judge slammed two crumpled test papers onto the table, both marked with a red F. Private tutors, special programs, thousands of dollars, and this is what I get. His words cut harder than the sound of breaking china. At the corner of the room, Imani Carter, the family's black nanny, froze mid-step with the breakfast tray in her hands. She'd raised other people's children for most of her life, but she'd never seen fear like this. "Sir," she said softly, steady but trembling inside, "please don't shout at them like that. They're trying to learn." Ethan's glare snapped toward her. "You don't tell me how to raise my children." "I wasn't telling, sir. I was asking for a little kindness." His tone turned venomous. "You think cleaning my house gives you the right to question me? You're the help. Imani, know your place." The words hit her like a slap. For a heartbeat, she said nothing, just stared at the fragments of glass on the floor. The reflection of his rage splintered into 1,000 tiny pieces. Brooke whispered, "Please don't fire her, Daddy." Ethan turned away, muttering, "Finish your breakfast." "I'm done talking." He stormed out, the door slamming behind him. Silence filled the room again. Imani knelt beside the twins, brushing the shards aside with her bare hand. "It's all right, baby," she whispered. "He doesn't mean it." But she knew deep down he did. As she gathered the broken pieces, a small red mark appeared on her palm where a shard had cut her skin. She wiped it with a napkin and looked toward the closed door. Something fierce flickered in her eyes, pain mixed with purpose. If this already made your blood boil, hit like and subscribe right now, because stories like this are still happening and the world needs to hear them. She stood up slowly, the cut still stinging, whispering to herself, maybe it's time someone taught this house what learning really means. The next morning came heavy with silence. The twins, Brooke and Lily, sat side by side at the long mahogany table, their pencils untouched. The faint sound of a ticking clock filled the mansion like a metronome of anxiety. Imani moved quietly between rooms, collecting laundry and straightening picture frames, but her mind stayed on the night before. Every echo of the judge's shout replayed in her head. She'd seen anger before, but this one felt colder, practiced, almost inherited. From the study down the hall, Judge Ethan's deep voice rumbled through the door. "Private Academy called again," he said into his phone. "They're concerned about my daughter's test performance. I'll handle it." His tone was calm now, but not kind. It was the calm of a man who controlled everything except the one thing that mattered. When Imani entered with the breakfast tray, the girl stiffened. "Eat your eggs before they get cold," she said softly. Brooke nodded, but Lily pushed her plate away. "He'll just yell again," the little one whispered. Imani knelt beside her. "He's hurting too, baby," she said, "but that doesn't make what he said right." Lily looked up, confused. "Then why don't you leave?" Imani paused, her eyes lowering. "Because sometimes the only way to change a house like this is from the inside." The girls stared at her, their fear giving way to curiosity. Imani smiled faintly. "Don't worry, we'll figure things out together." Later that afternoon, when the judge left for court, Imani found the twins sitting by the window, drawing on scraps of paper. "You two love colors, don't you?" she asked. Brooke nodded. "More than numbers," she said. "Numbers are boring." Imani chuckled. "That's because no one ever showed you their stories." The girls tilted their heads. "Stories? Every number has one," she said, "but you have to listen carefully to hear it." As sunlight spilled across the floor, the three of them began connecting dots on paper. Not just math, but beginnings of trust. And somewhere deep inside, Imani felt a spark she hadn't felt in years. The quiet return of the teacher she once was. She glanced at the grand clock again, knowing the judge would be home by 7. By then, she promised herself, his daughters would see math and themselves differently. That evening, rain tapped against the mansion's tall windows while thunder rolled far away. The judge was still at work, his daughters tucked quietly in their room with half-finished homework spread across the bed. Imani stood at the doorway holding 2 cups of warm cocoa. "Mind if I sit with y'all a bit?" The girls nodded eagerly. She set the mugs down and glanced at the open math sheets. Columns of numbers, wrong answers circled in red. "Let's try something different," she said, pulling out a small notepad. "Imagine 2 trains racing each other through a storm. One goes faster, but starts later. Which one gets there first?" Lily frowned. "That's not in the book." Imani smiled. "That's the point. Math isn't just in books. It's hiding in stories." Within minutes, the twins leaned over the pad, sketching trains and lightning bolts, counting seconds aloud. When they shouted the right answer together, Imani clapped softly. "See? You just did algebra and didn't even know it." For the first time in weeks, laughter filled the room. The tension lifted like mist after rain. Downstairs, the grandfather clock struck 9. "Okay," Imani whispered, gathering the papers. "Our secret class stays between us, deal?" "Deal," they chimed, giggling as she switched off the light. But the secret didn't stay hidden for long. The next afternoon, as Imani carried clean linens up the staircase, she heard the judge's sister, Martha, talking sharply in the hall. "Ethan, your girls told my son their nanny teaches them math now. Have you lost your mind?" Imani froze mid-step. The judge sighed. "I'll handle it." That night, when he returned home early, the laughter stopped. He stood at the doorway of the twins' room, watching Imani draw tiny rocket ships on their worksheets. "So this is what you call cleaning?" His voice was low, dangerous. Imani turned slowly. "Sir, they were learning." "Learning from you?" He stepped closer. "I told you to stay in your lane. You're here to care for them, not to play teacher." Her throat tightened. "Respectfully, sir, someone had to." His hand slammed against the doorframe, startling the twins. "Pack your things after dinner. You're done here." Imani's chest ached, but she forced a calm smile toward the girls. "It's all right, babies. Remember, every number has a story." She walked past them, her steps steady, her heart breaking. Behind her, the twins cried softly while thunder cracked outside again, echoing the sound of justice still waiting to be heard. If this happened right in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want justice as much as I do, hit subscribe. The next morning, the house felt emptier than usual. Imani packed her small suitcase quietly, folding each piece of clothing with trembling hands. The scent of lemon polish and children's shampoo lingered in the air, reminders of a home that never truly felt like hers. Brooke and Lily tiptoed into her room, their eyes red from crying. Brooke held a small drawing, 2 rockets flying side by side, one labeled Miss Imani, the other us. "Please don't go," she whispered. Imani knelt to their level. "Sweethearts, I don't make the rules here." "But Daddy's wrong," Lily said softly. "You made us love learning." Before Imani could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Judge Ethan stood in the doorway, his jaw set, eyes dark with guilt he didn't know how to name. "Girls, give Miss Imani some space." They hesitated. Brooke turned, voice small but fierce. "You're the one who needs space, Daddy. Space to listen." The words stung. Ethan's lips parted, but no sound came. He stepped aside as the girls ran down the corridor. Imani straightened, suitcase handle trembling in her hand. "Sir, I never meant to overstep." "I know," he said quietly. "But you did." She nodded once, holding his gaze. "Then I'll leave knowing your daughters found something no tutor could give, belief in themselves." Ethan watched her walk away, the echo of her footsteps fading down the grand staircase. Hours later, silence haunted the mansion. He poured himself a drink, but every sip tasted like shame. The twins sat across from each other at the dining table, their homework untouched again. Without Imani's presence, the house felt colder, lifeless. When Ethan passed the hallway that evening, he heard faint giggles. He stopped. Through the crack in the door, he saw the twins huddled beneath a blanket fort, flashlight flickering. Brooke whispered, "If rocket echoes faster." Ethan froze. The rest of the sentence belonged to Monty's voice echoing in memory. What if math was a story? He didn't interrupt. He just stood there, realizing he had fired the only person who made his daughters feel safe enough to learn. For the first time in years, Judge Ethan Caldwell felt small and very, very human. The following week, the Caldwell mansion became a house of silence. The twins barely spoke at breakfast. Their bright chatter vanished, replaced by long stares and cold plates. The judge noticed it all, but pride held his tongue like a shackle. At work, whispers followed him. His sister Martha had wasted no time spreading the story. Ethan fired his nanny for teaching, one colleague murmured. Word is, she overstepped. Typical. At the courthouse, even his clerks noticed a shift. The man once feared for his precision now looked distracted, verdicts delivered without conviction, eyes drifting toward memories he didn't understand. That night, Martha arrived uninvited, heels clicking across marble. "You can't let this go on," she said sharply. "The board's asking questions. A black nanny teaching her daughters? It looks bad, Ethan." He looked up from his paperwork, jaw tight. "Bad for who?" "For all of us," she hissed. "For the family name. You're a judge, not a charity case." He exhaled slowly. "Martha, you think skin color changes the truth? Those girls learn more from her in 1 week than any private tutor could teach in a year." Martha scoffed. "Don't romanticize her, Ethan. You can't save everyone." "Maybe not," he said quietly, "but I can start with the two sitting upstairs crying themselves to sleep." She turned away, furious, muttering, "You'll regret this." After she left, Ethan sat alone in his study, the room lit only by a single lamp. He picked up one of the twins' drawings that had fallen between his files. 2 stick figures holding hands, labeled Miss Imani and Us. Something broke inside him. Not anger, not guilt, something deeper. The realization that power meant nothing if it couldn't protect innocence. The next morning, he drove through downtown Charleston until he reached a modest neighborhood. The streets were quiet, lined with cracked sidewalks and old oak trees. He parked outside a small duplex and stared at the door number written on the slip of paper the twins had left on his desk. For the first time, Judge Ethan Caldwell wasn't sure what to say or how to begin. But he knew one thing. He wasn't leaving until Imani Carter answered that door. The morning sun painted Charleston in soft gold as Judge Ethan stood outside Imani's modest duplex, clutching a small folder. His polished shoes looked out of place against the cracked pavement. He took a breath and knocked. The door opened slowly. Imani stood there, wearing a faded blue sweater, eyes tired but calm. "Judge Caldwell," she said quietly, not hiding the surprise in her tone. I came to apologize," he said, voice uneven, "and to ask for something I don't deserve." Her brows furrowed. "An apology's enough, sir. You don't owe me." He cut her off gently. "No, I owe you more than I can say. My daughters haven't smiled since you left. And I realized something. They didn't fail math. I did." For the first time, she saw the weight in his eyes. The same man who had barked orders and slammed doors now looked small, just a father trying to mend what his pride had broken. "I came here," he continued, "to ask if you come back. Not as help, not as a maid, as their teacher." Imani's breath caught. "You'd really let me do that?" "I'd insist on it." He handed her the folder. Inside were 2 letters, both written in shaky, childish handwriting. One read, "We miss you, Miss Imani." The other, "You taught us more than numbers. You taught us brave." Her eyes shimmered. "They wrote these." He nodded. "And they're waiting for you." Later that day, when Imani walked back into the mansion, the twins ran down the stairs shouting her name. She hugged them tight as their laughter filled the house again. From the doorway, Ethan watched, not as a judge, but as a man learning humility for the first time. Weeks passed. Under Imani's guidance, the twins began thriving. Their grades soared, but more importantly, they rediscovered joy. During a school event, one teacher asked how they'd improved so fast. Lily grinned proudly. We got a new kind of teacher, one who tells stories that sound like life. The room went silent, then erupted in applause. Ethan's chest swelled with pride, not for himself, but for the woman who had given his family back at heart. Weeks turned into months, and the Caldwell house began to feel like a home again. The walls that once echoed with anger now carried laughter, piano notes, and the soft hum of Imani's gospel tunes in the kitchen. One evening, as autumn sunlight poured through the curtains, Ethan stood by the window, watching his daughters chase each other across the yard. Brooke was shouting answers from a math riddle Imani had turned into a scavenger hunt. Lily giggled as she solved each clue. Ethan smiled quietly. It was a kind of joy money couldn't buy, the kind that heals from the inside out. When Imani entered the room carrying tea, he turned toward her. "You changed this house," he said. "You changed me." She looked up, her expression soft but steady. "No, sir. You just started listening." They sat outside on the porch as dusk settled over Charleston. The air smelled of pine and distant rain. The twins had gone to bed, their drawings pinned proudly on the fridge. Rockets, flowers, and a picture of Judge holding hands with his daughters and their black teacher. Ethan broke the silence. "I'm working on something new," he said. "A scholarship program for kids who never got the chances my daughters had. I want you to help me design it." Imani blinked. "Me?" "Yes. You've already built a blueprint. Compassion, patience, and courage." She laughed softly, eyes glistening. "You really think the world's ready for that?" He looked toward the night sky. Ready or not, it's time it learned. For a moment, neither spoke. The cicadas hummed, the stars blinked awake, and the porch light glowed like a small promise between them. Imani leaned back, whispering, "You know, Judge Caldwell, teaching your daughters reminded me of something my mama used to say." "What's that?" She said, "Real education doesn't happen in classrooms. It happens when hearts learn how to see people as equal." Ethan nodded slowly, voice low. "Then I guess we all went back to school." A quiet laugh passed between them, not of humor, but of peace, the kind that comes when old wounds finally stop bleeding. Inside, the twins' laughter echoed faintly down the hall, the sound of a new legacy being written one bedtime story at a time. If you believe this should never happen again, share this now. And to my USA, UK, and Canadian viewers, your voice is power. Use it.